UPRISING, Tales of the Magi Saga by Andrew Dobell. Chapter 1. Ellie. Ellie risked a quick glance behind her, just one quick look. Maybe he wasn't there anymore, maybe he'd gone. But who was she kidding? He'd still be there. Her blood pumped hard, coursing through her body as her heart hammered like a drum in her chest, while she concentrated on putting one foot in front of the other and not falling over in these ridiculous high heels. She couldn't take it anymore. She had to know. She had to see if he was still behind her. But what if he was still there? She didn't understand it. It made no sense. He never seemed to be running. Instead, every time she looked, he was walking, slowly, but with dread purpose, focused solely on her and nothing else. And yet, she was running as fast as she could, trying to get away from him. But no matter how fast she ran, he was always the same short distance behind her. There up ahead, the left turn that would put her on her own street and within a stone's throw of her home and safety. She reached it and grabbed the railing in front of the houses to her left and looked back down the street. Gone. The man wasn't there anymore. Only the usual pedestrians and cars. But no strange man. Still breathing hard, she didn't want to be out here anymore, so she jogged down her road towards her house. It was quiet down here, really quiet. She looked around her at the street and the houses. No people, no cars, nothing. Just her. Something wasn't right here. This was London. No street in London was this quiet, certainly not hers. She looked back at the road she'd left, seeing a car drive along it, past the entrance to her road. There were people over there, but none down here. She continued on, jogging steadily but looking about her, expecting someone or something to just jump out at her at any moment. Nothing did, but her pounding heart and pumping adrenaline didn't ease up. If anything, they got worse. She felt terrified, and yet could see nothing. But that was the issue. If there were people about, if her street had not been abnormally quiet, even at this late hour, she felt sure she would calm down. She reached the bottom of the steps that led up to her door and stopped. Peering into the darkness, she did her best to see if anything, or more importantly, anyone was approaching her. But she saw nothing. She turned and looked the way she'd just come, back to the street where she had last seen the man, wondering if he might be only now turning onto her street. Would he see where she lived? Would he try to break in and find her in her own home? She'd call Richard. He'd know what to do. He'd be round here so quickly. She recalled the moment just a few minutes ago now, as she'd turned onto the side street she usually took to walk home. A small cut-through that had a few shops on it and always had a few people milling about, wandering through on their walk through the city. She'd nearly walked straight into a man coming the other way. She stepped sideways to go around him, but he stepped with her, blocking her path. She moved again, thinking he'd tried to move out of her way as well, but he moved again too, blocking her still. She looked up at him then, getting a proper look at his face and his eyes that were already fixed on her. A smile on his lips told her everything she wanted to know. He was doing this on purpose, and he was enjoying it. Movement at the bottom of her field of vision caught her eye, causing her to look down and see the knife he'd just pulled. She screamed and backed off, but he followed her, moved with her and seemed unconcerned by her scream. She wailed again, screaming, "Knife! He's got a knife! Help me, please!" But got only dirty looks from the people nearby, dismissing her fear as trivial. The man continued towards her, his knife held openly, glinting in the darkness from the glow of the streetlights. Why wasn't anyone taking any notice of her? Why were they looking at her like she was some sort of lunatic? "No one's going to help you, Ellie. No one," said the man in a strong, gravelly voice. That's when she'd run away, only glancing behind her after a few hundred yards and noticing that the man was still so close to her and walking towards her. But he'd gone now, and so had everyone else. Ellie pulled out her phone and pressed the power button to light up the screen. The low battery icon flashed up, and the screen died, fading to black. Shit, she cursed, tapping the button a few more times, trying to get the phone to light up, but without any luck. She shoved it into her handbag and turned back around. She felt sure she'd just seen something out of the corner of her eye. Movement in the darkness, just beyond that pool of light from the overhead street lamp. She'd seen something. She peered ahead of her, squinting into the darkness, a shadowy umbra that seemed way too dark to be natural. She almost wasn't surprised when the man stepped forward, moving into the pool of light, staring over at her the whole time. She'd kind of expected it. With everything that had been happening, it seemed only fitting that he would be in front of her now. She didn't waste any time and darted up the steps to her front door, fumbling in her handbag for her keys. Her heart rate kicked up a gear, and her adrenaline spiked as she hunted through her bag. "Damn it, where are you? Come on," she muttered to herself nervously. Suddenly her fingers touched the familiar cold metal of her keys and pulled them out of her bag. They caught on the zip for a moment and slipped from her grasp. Suddenly they were falling, only for her to somehow catch them again and save them. With a firm but trembling hold on them, she rifled through her keys, hunting for the right one. It was on here somewhere. She didn't have that many. Car key, back door key, gate key, bike lock key, garage key, suitcase key. Where was her front door key? She was trembling so much she had probably missed it. She cycled through them again, finding one she had missed before, but didn't recognize. What did that unlock? On the third time, she found her front door key and struggled to separate it from the others. Her hands shook the entire time from the panic that filled her as she glanced behind her to see the man getting closer. She pressed up against the door and desperately attempted to sink the key into the lock, only for it to scratch about on the exterior, missing the obvious key-shaped hole despite her best efforts. "Come on, get in there," she whispered, until finally the key caught in the hole and with a quick adjustment, sank into the lock. With a click, she unlocked the door, pushed it open, withdrew the key, and with a glance at the man at the bottom of her steps, slammed the door shut. Ellie double-locked the latch and put the chain on, before backing away from the door. She tried to steady her breathing and get herself under control again, taking a slow and deep breath that shuddered through her frame as her heart beat like a hammer. Any harder, and it might burst from her chest. She forced herself to take another breath and another, slowly getting her panic under control. She reached into her bag again and withdrew her phone. It shouldn't have died. She'd used it maybe 10 minutes ago, before meeting the stalker, and it had been fine. She pressed the button a few more times to try to get it to turn on, but nothing happened. "Bloody thing!" she cursed. For a moment she thought she'd heard something, so she froze to the spot and listened. After a few moments of utter silence, she wondered if she'd imagined it. Could it be him, outside the door, wanting to get in? She needed to plug her phone into the charger and call her brother. He'd know what to do. Standing up straight, her eyes focused on the peephole in the door. Was he still out there waiting for her? Maybe he'd try to break her door down or find some other way inside. The thought terrified her. She felt sure she wouldn't sleep tonight, that was for sure, unless Richard came around. Then maybe she could. Her brother would put this right, she felt sure of that. She had to see, she had to know if he was out there waiting for her. So she put her eye to the peephole and looked through it to see the distorted fisheye view of her front steps. Empty. He'd gone. She adjusted her stance to a more comfortable one and continued to look out through her door, half expecting to spot him suddenly, stood in the shadows, watching her house. Instead, she saw a car drive past and then a couple walking hand in hand in the cool winter's air, talking happily. Where were they a moment ago? She stepped back from her door with a frown, feeling a little confused. Maybe it was nothing. She just happened to be on her street during a quiet moment, maybe. She looked down at her phone again, remembering that she needed to charge it, and turned into the house, nearly walking straight into the man that was standing behind her. "Hello, Ellie," said that same deep, gravelly voice she had heard only a few minutes ago. She stepped back in shock, her mouth hanging open as she stared up at the man that had been outside only seconds ago, but who now stood in her hallway. He appeared a little dishevelled. His clothes looked like they had been worn almost continually for a year or two, as they were covered in holes and threadbare rips as he stood there, staring at her with that same haunting smile playing over his lips in a way that promised only pain and death. "But how did you—" "Hush now," he said, and strange glowing blue energy played up his arm and over his hand like unnatural flames when it suddenly lashed out, and Ellie flew sideways before hitting the wall with bone-crunching force. Ellie whimpered as she fell to the floor in a heap. What the hell was that? Some kind of strange blue force had shot out of his hand and thrown her across the room and into the wall like a rag doll. Pain bloomed across her shoulder and arm, which had taken the brunt of the hit. Something felt wrong in her shoulder, out of place maybe. Had she broken something? She tried to use her left arm, but when the stabbing pain lanced through her body, she let her arm go limp. She felt sure she had broken something, her clavicle perhaps. She used her other arm and shifted herself up into a sitting position, and glanced up at the man again as he glared down on her with a sick sort of glee. What are you?" Ellie asked, seeing the curious blue energy playing over his arm again. "Take a guess," he said, clearly enjoying her suffering. I can't, it hurts, I think I've broken something," she said as she winced once again. "Guess!" the man shouted, his tone leaving no room for questioning. The force of that shout was almost physical, nearly knocking her over onto her back. This was crazy, she thought, as she looked up at the glowing blue light that rippled and flowed over his hand and arm again. Could it be magic or something? "Are you like a Death Eater?" she said, feeling very unsure about anything anymore. The world had suddenly gone quite mad, and nothing really made much sense to her. Who was this man who could somehow appear in her home out of thin air? The man laughed a deep, hearty laugh that Ellie would have enjoyed if it had come from a friend. But coming from this man, this stalker, it felt anything but friendly. He seemed impressed. "This isn't Harry Potter, my dear, and no heroic trio is going to save you today. But that was impressive. I must give credit where credit is due after all. You really are quite perceptive. I am officially impressed. You're right, this is indeed magic." He waved his hand about. As she watched, dark shapes moved in the shadows of her unlit home. "Magic?" she asked. Was he serious? This was crazy. But... "Oh, I'm bored now," the man said, and there was a flash of blue light and a body shaking pain for the briefest of seconds. And then, nothing. Carson watched with a somewhat bored expression, one eyebrow raised, blinking a few times as the girl suddenly exploded in a haze of blood while bits of flesh from her body splattered against the walls. He smiled again. The sight of a pitiful riven human getting their just desserts was always a satisfying end to the day. He didn't get to do it nearly enough these days. With a thought, he pulled on the magical essence and cancelled the illusion magic he'd placed upon her and walked over to the centre of the blood and gore. Squatting down, he reached into Ellie's handbag and withdrew the phone. He tapped the power button and sure enough, the phone lit up, as it had been doing with Ellie each time she'd pressed the button, only she couldn't see it. With a swipe, he was in and hunting through her messages until he spotted the thread he wanted. Chapter 2. Coming Home. With a sudden but fleeting feeling of dislocation and a flash of white light, Liz was no longer in New York. She now stood on the rooftop of a block of council flats in the northeast of London, the cold winter air whipping about her and blowing her long blonde hair everywhere. She turned into the wind and brushed the stray hairs from her face before taking a moment to pull it all into a ponytail that she secured with a hairband. Stood next to her was Gentle Water, the wind pulling at his leather jacket as his magic faded after the port. She eyed him as he looked about himself, no doubt wondering where she had brought him. They stood on loose gravel on the rooftop of a large block of flats. Most of the apartments in the block would be owned by the local council, although a few of them were now privately owned, bought by the occupants from the council through its rent-to-buy scheme. "Where are we?" Gentle Water asked. Liz smiled as she finished sorting out her hair. "I used to call this home. This was where I lived with my mum and sister before, she said. She never really enjoyed talking about it. Even now, 2 years later, it could still feel a little raw and emotional. "I see," he muttered. "You wanted to come home?" "After everything that happened, I just wanted to see it all again. I've not been back here since I left London on that train with Raven, on the run from Nate and the Inquisitors. But I thought I just wanted to come home, think some things through, "Of course, I understand," Gentle Water said in his soft Chinese accent. "Call me when you're ready to return." Liz smiled. "I will, and thank you." With a surge of magical essentia, followed by a whip crack of air rushing into the space that he had once occupied, Gentle Water disappeared. Liz was looking forward to learning that little trick, but she wasn't there yet. She had progressed from the rank of apprentice to adept, but porting was a knight-level magical ability. It was only a matter of time and effort to get there, though. Liz pulled her jacket about her and zipped it up to shut out the cold air and looked over the surrounding rooftop. Liz had never been up here. Even when she had lived here, it wasn't something that had ever really occurred to her to do. But with just a cursory glance, she soon found a nearby access door she hoped would lead down into the building itself. Liz walked over, her trainers crunching the gravel beneath her feet. She passed close to the edge of the building as she walked and looked down into the courtyard far below. She recognized the large paved area, the dilapidated play park, and the usual locals and residents walking and standing down there. Was this the right thing to do? She hadn't been back here for so long now. It felt like a lifetime ago, and yet it was only 2 years. So much had happened to her. She'd lost everything, but also gained so much as well. It all felt a little overwhelming when she really thought about it. With the most recent events she had been involved with, though, she needed some time to think things through, to go back, to see the life she had left behind. Liz knew that her mentor Amanda had done something similar during her time as a magus, visiting the orphanage she had grown up in back in Ireland. She'd even somehow got an old friend of hers involved in the hidden world that Liz, Amanda, Gentle Water and the others were now a part of. She hoped nothing like that happened here, though. She had enough on her plate without getting a friend possessed or bitten by a vampire. Liz reached the door and tried the handle, predictably finding it locked. She'd guessed this would happen, not that it would be an issue for her. She summoned up some essentia and, with a quick force of will, aimed a matter rip effect at the lock. The whole area of the lock and around it looked like it had been suddenly attacked with a flurry of hammer blows in the space of a split second, reducing the lock to a ruin of metal. Liz pulled on the door again, swinging it open easily with a metallic squeak, and stepped inside, out of the wind and down a few steps into a service area, with some caged-off pipes and machinery and various bits of cleaning gear, tools and other items of the caretaker trade. She quickly found a doorway and attempted a more focused and less destructive version of the same effect. With a clunk, the door swung free. This time she'd ruined the lock, but the door would close and stay closed. She smiled at her minor triumph and walked through, closing the door behind her as she stepped into the corridor beyond the door. Memories flooded back, triggered by the familiar sounds and smells of the block that had once been her home. The walls might as well be made of paper for all the soundproofing they provided, and she could hear mums shouting at their kids, children running riot, televisions blaring out the soccer game. Soccer game. Geez, she'd been in America too long. Liz wondered which football teams were playing. Was it a local derby? She didn't care, really. She moved off down the corridor and soon found the central flight of stairs that would take her down to the floor she wanted to be on. She could take the elevator, sure, but it just didn't feel right. Liz wanted to take her time, to see her old haunt again. She started down the stairs and made her way through level after level, floor after floor, passing a couple of people she didn't recognize. She'd lived on the 3rd floor and didn't really come up much beyond the 5th, so these upper 10 floors were new to her, really. Liz soon made it down 9 floors only to pause on the block's 6th level, wondering what she might find down here, who she might see. She'd had a few casual friends who lived in the building, but she'd grown apart from them during the last year or so that she'd lived here. Instead, she spent more and more time with her sister, Fran, and the 2 boys, Stephen and Ben, that they had grown closer to through their shared interest in the occult. She felt sure that most of her old friends who lived here would likely still be around, doing whatever it was they did. What was it they used to do? She had difficulty remembering, actually. Whatever it was of little consequence. It made her laugh to think about it now. They'd thought themselves so important, so clued into what was really going on in the world, and yet they really had no idea at all. She rounded the corner and descended the next flight of stairs to the window that looked out over the courtyard before doing a 180-degree turn and walking down the next flight to the 5th floor, finding that she recognized some of this now. Some stains on the walls and the graffiti that accompanied them seemed familiar. Turning again to drop down the next flight of steps, she saw 3 girls with their back to her, leaning against the banister and looking out over the courtyard. Her enhanced hearing picked up the sound of one of the girls chewing gum while her nose recoiled at the stench of cigarette smoke that surrounded them. They seemed familiar to her, and it gave her pause for a moment, wondering if she really wanted to walk past them. They were bound to turn around. Well, she came here to confront her past. Why flinch away from it now? She started to make her way down the next flight of steps, approaching the girls below her. The one on the right turned and gave her a curious look. Liz recognized her immediately. It was Tracy. Like most of the kids on these estates, you soon learnt to take care of yourself because life here was tough. Many of the children that lived here came from broken families. Many of them were also the victims of abuse or neglect, and that led to bullying and fights. There was a distinct hierarchy here as well, and you did well to remember your place in it and give respect to those who would otherwise hurt you if you didn't. Of course, by respect, that usually meant giving up your pocket money, or for the older kids, if you were unlucky, your phone or other stuff. If you didn't, you'd return home with a black eye or missing some teeth. Liz had always been the quiet one. Her twin sister, though, Francesca, was anything but. She was always loud and confident and acted as something of a protector around Liz. Liz always hated going anywhere without Fran. Fran could handle herself and always gave as good as she got. She didn't take any shit from any of the bullies and made sure that Liz didn't either. But Fran couldn't be there all the time. On more occasions than she cared to remember, Liz had run afoul of Tracy and her friends. It usually ended with her losing some money or some clothes, only for Fran to seek revenge later. Sure, it was nice to have such a strong and protective sister, but when Fran beat up Tracy and her mates, it only served to piss them off further, so the next time Liz was caught alone, things were worse. That was then, though, and this was now, and everything had changed. Tracy just stared as she walked down the stairs. Liz chanced a couple of glances at Tracy, but otherwise did her best to ignore the young woman. She wasn't scared of her anymore. When you faced off against murderous nomad Magi who want you dead, or enormous werewolves who want to eat your insides, the local bully isn't really going to cut it anymore. But even so, she really wasn't in the mood to deal with the likes of Tracy. Tracy, though, had other ideas, it seemed. As Liz reached the landing and went to make the turn to go down the next flight of stairs, suddenly Tracy moved and slid in front of her. "Liz, it's you, isn't it?" Tracy was entirely too close to her, so Liz took half a step back so they weren't all but touching each other. "Tracy, good to see you. How have you been?" Tracy took a long drag on her cigarette, looking at Liz through the smoke, before she stopped, removed it from her mouth and blew the smoke in Liz's face. "Where have you been hiding then?" Tracy asked. Liz could see the other 2 girls had turned to look, wondering what this brief confrontation was all about. Liz knew them too. They were Tracy's closest friends, Courtney and Barb, both of them just as bad as Tracy. "Fuck me, is that little Lizzie?" Courtney said between loud chews of her gum. "Bloody hell, it is," Barb confirmed. "Where have you been these past few years then, hey? And where's your sister?" Tracy asked, stepping in closer. Liz sighed quietly. This was going about as well as she expected, really. These three were always causing trouble, and it looked like they were on the warpath again. True, they had a history, so maybe it was inevitable, but Liz had hoped they might have grown out of it by now, matured a little. But then, 2 years really wasn't a lot. Liz was 17 now, getting towards 18, which put these three in that 18 to 19 range. Also, Liz had seen and done an awful lot over these 2 years, whereas these three probably hadn't even left the city, let alone the country. This estate and this block were their territory. This was where they were strongest. This was where they had respect. When she thought about it, it didn't really surprise her they hadn't really changed that much. Were creatures of habit, after all. Liz gave no more ground. In fact, she leant into Tracy as she answered her. "Fran is dead, as is my mum, and what I was doing up there is none of your business." Oh, that felt good. That felt magnificent, actually. And seeing the look on Tracy's face was just the icing on the cake, really. "The fuck you say?" Tracy said, looking incredulous. "Excuse me, I don't have time for this," Liz said, hoping she could avoid the confrontation. She didn't really want to have things get out of hand. Stepping sideways, Liz made to go around Tracy, but she moved too and blocked Liz's path, pushing her face in towards Liz. "This little bitch needs to be reminded of how things are around here," Tracy said, apparently wanting backup from her mates, who stepped towards Liz as well. Liz sighed internally. She'd figured something like this would happen, so she wasn't surprised. "Well," she thought, "here we go." Liz spotted the shifting of Tracy's body weight as she moved to deliver a hit to Liz, broadcasting her attack way before it actually hit her. Watching the movement, it was almost comical. Only a few years ago she would have missed these details and had no clue of what to do, but things were very different now. Liz caught Tracy's hand easily and wasted no time in giving it a sharp twist, spinning Tracy around and putting her into a painful arm lock. Liz knew the feeling well. She had been put into it many times during her training. It felt like your arm was about to pop from its socket. "Ah!" Tracy yelped. "What the hell?" said one of the other girls. To her left, Courtney went for her, again telegraphing her movements too far in advance. Liz lashed out and caught her in the face with a swift and sharp strike. Courtney also dropped to her knees with a yell, holding her bleeding nose and mouth in her hand. "Why, you little—" Barb hissed as she launched herself at Liz. With the heel of her hand, Liz broke the girl's nose before sweeping her legs with her foot, dropping her to the floor with a painful thud. Barb stayed there, whimpering. Liz turned her attention back to Tracy, who was bent over before her, still struggling in Liz's arm lock, hissing and panting with the pain. "Want me to break it?" Liz asked. Fuck you, bitch," Tracy spat. "As you wish," Liz said, and jerked Tracy's arm. Liz heard the crack clearly before she let go, and Tracy dropped to the floor, crying with the pain. "Like I said, it's none of your business. Good day to you," she said, and continued on down the stairs and away from the three bullies. She couldn't help the smile that played over her face. She didn't like hurting anyone, but sometimes some people just deserved it. Those three girls had made her life on this estate a living hell for far too many years, so teaching them a brief lesson like that felt amazing. She gained a fresh spring in her step as she descended a couple more floors before reaching the third, where she turned away from the stairwell and made her way along an eerily familiar corridor. Memories of her time here, her life living here with her mum and her sister, came flooding back. She'd walked these corridors countless times, and they were filled with memories, both good and bad. A few more steps, and the front door to her old home came into view. She couldn't help the rush of emotion that filled her, choked her up and filled her eyes with tears. She missed her mum, but most of all she missed her sister. She loved her mother, but she was never as close to her as she was to Francesca. She had many lovely memories of her mother, though, of her love and commitment. She worked all the hours she could, working 2 jobs to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table, but left her and her sister to fend for themselves. They were often home alone for hours on end. Some days they wouldn't even see their mother. This naturally led to the relationship she had with Fran being a much stronger one. They were already twins, so their bond was already powerful, but their situation, that they had to do everything themselves in the home, only made that relationship stronger. But now they were gone. Killed 2 years ago by supernatural forces that wanted something Liz and her friends had come into possession of. They had paid a high price, and sometimes Liz wondered if it had all been worth it. A nomad magus called Nate had killed her mother, but it had been an inquisitor that had killed Fran. She held a special hatred for these inquisitors, and one day she would exact her revenge on them. She would pay them back for what they had done to her. Liz shook her head. She didn't enjoy thinking like that. She hated that her head went to dark places when she thought back to the events that led to her becoming a magus. They were dark times, difficult times filled with pain and tears, but her life had become so much more since. She had walked a path that so few people get to travel upon, and she knew Fran would be proud of her, jealous, but proud. It was a thought that she tried to remember every day, because that, above everything else, kept her going. She was doing this for her sister. She was living this life, learning about magic, and learning to look after herself because it was what Fran would have wanted. Looking at that once familiar door to the home she had once had, she considered having a look inside. She could use her magic, send her senses into the apartment and see the new owners, see what they had done to it, to her and Fran's room. But why? What was the point of that? It would likely only upset her, and the whole thing seemed like she was just living in the past, trying to recapture those thoughts and feelings. But she knew that was impossible. The world had moved on. Other people lived there now and called it home. And who was she to go poking her nose in there? Her life wasn't here anymore. Liz turned away and left the apartment block, heading back outside onto the streets. She wondered why she'd come here suddenly. Why was she doing this? She thought she'd wanted some time to think after recent events in New York and Texas. Memories of that day filled her mind again, making her shudder with disgust at the thought of it. Dealing with nomads was one thing. You expected them to be crazy and evil. That was kind of their thing. But when the threat came from other Arcadians, then things got a little more complicated. One of her earliest lessons with Amanda, as she took her under her wing and taught her how to harness her magic, was about the various dangers she would encounter as a magus. The factions she would deal with as she navigated this world. She, along with her mentor Amanda and Gentle Water, were Arcadians, the largest Magi group whose primary purpose was to oppose the nomads and to protect humanity. Then there were the nomads, basically the bad guys. They worshipped dark gods called Archons and saw themselves as above humanity and prepared for their dread master's return by corrupting the masses and fighting the Arcadians. The Inquisition, by comparison, were a much newer group. These delusional Magi were a part of the Vatican and believed their magic was, in fact, God-given and not magic at all. They saw all other Magi as the pawns of Satan and hunted them down accordingly. These were fairly straightforward guidelines to follow, but when another Arcadian coven, called the Magi Legion, took Amanda, Gentle Water, and herself in for questioning, things grew a little more blurred. She'd known they were after Amanda and that they used Gentle Water and herself as leverage. The thought of being tied to that chair in that dirty cell, stripped and hurt by these so-called Arcadians, only made her shudder. Liz remembered the pain, the hits and punches, the screams of her friends, the whole nightmare. She had been used against her friend and mentor. She had been leverage, plain and simple. She hated that. The thought of someone who was supposed to be on their side, exploiting their love for each other for their own twisted gains, made her sick. It reminded her of what happened to her mother and the parents of her friends, how the nomad Nate had done the same thing, using their relationships with their parents against them. She walked up the suburban street and reached the corner of Stevens Road. Up there, on the left, she thought, that's where the reality of the world she would come to be a part of really revealed what it was capable of. That's where they went on the run, that's where they had first encountered the Inquisitors, and that's where her life had truly changed. "Liz Fox?" said a voice from nearby. Liz blinked the growing tears away from her eyes and turned to look at whoever had just called her name. A young man stood there, just a little older than her, in his mid-20s, wearing a leather jacket and jeans. He was a good-looking man with a shape that suggested he worked out. Yes, who are you?" she asked. The man stepped forward with a smile as Liz shifted her vision into the magical spectrum. The world around her suddenly glowed with a silver light as the ebb and flow of the local essentia was suddenly visible to her. She spotted the aegis, the magical shield around this man straight away. He was a magus, like her. "It is you! Great!" The man offered her his hand. "Richard, I'm with a local coven. It's such a pleasure to meet you. I've heard so much about you. Well, about Amanda, but you too. What brings you to London?" Ah, Liz thought, a fan. Amanda had become something of a well-known magus over the past few months, with tales of her exploits being told through the secretive Magi forums. Much of it was embellished and blown out of all proportion, but her name and her adventures had been talked about and spread far and wide. As a side effect, those in Amanda's coven, her close associates, were also within that spotlight, and it wasn't the first time that a magus she had never met before had walked up to her and known her name and more. She wasn't sure she liked it, but she had little control over it. "Well, thank you. It's nice to meet you too. I used to live here, so just visiting. Reminiscing, I suppose," she said, smiling. "Oh, great. I didn't know you were British. I just saw that you guys were in New York and assumed..." "Yeah, I've had that before. We're from all over, really. Amanda's Irish, you know." "I think I'd heard that somewhere, but then lots of Yanks call themselves Irish, don't they?" "Yeah, well, they're just proud of their heritage, I suppose," Liz said. "Oh, I wish I could introduce you to my coven. Anna would love to meet you. You don't have any spare time, do you?" Liz looked at him, thoughts of her recent ordeal with the Legion running through her mind. She needed some sort of proof of who they were, and she knew just how to get it. "What's your name? Your full name and coven name?" "Richard Goddard with the Britannic Guardians Coven," he answered. "Gimme a moment," she said, and backed away from Richard a short distance and sent a pulse through her link with Sean. It took only a moment, and suddenly the mental link with Sean back in New York opened up. "Liz, always a pleasure. What can I do for you?" she heard in her head. "Hi, Sean," she replied, sending her thoughts through the link. "I need you to check something for me. I've met some Magi here. Do you have a record of a Britannic Guardians Coven with a member called Richard?" "One moment," he said as the link went quiet. He was no doubt hunting through the online forums and computer databases that he had been compiling in the basement of Amanda's coven house to find the answer that Liz was after. She looked back at Richard, who stood nearby, clearly curious to know what her answer would be. "Okay, got it. Yeah, he's legit. Richard Goddard. The coven leader is Anna. There's also Jenna, Callie, and Rory, the Britannic Guardians." Wow, how pretentious is that name? "Anyway, yeah, they're on the council's records from what I can tell. They seem friendly. I'm not getting any red flags. I even have a photo of a few of them. This is Richard," he said, and the image of Richard's face appeared in her mind's eye along with Sean's mental message. "Okay, great. Thanks, Sean," she said. "Anytime, Blondie," he said and closed the link. She looked back at Richard, still smiling from Sean's Blondie comment. "Hey, so yeah, I can spare a little time. Let's go and meet your coven, she said. Checking up on me, were you? He asked. Yeah, sorry, but I don't know you from Adam, so... It's okay, I get it. He smiled at her. Okay, cool. So, I've heard a lot about what happened on that island. Can I ask you a few questions? Liz did her best to answer his questions as they walked through the streets away from Stephen's house. Even with her initial apprehension, she was actually glad of the distraction. The thoughts of her friends and their untimely deaths were all getting a little oppressive, and frankly, that wasn't why she was here. She didn't want to get all depressed and upset. She had hoped to find some perspective on things, but so far hadn't found too much of it. The house that Richard eventually turned into was a 3-story detached affair, a period house with plenty of ornate decorations that had been darkened and muted with time and erosion. Surrounded by hedges, they had plenty of privacy, and the whole property seemed like a good base for a coven to set up shop. Nice place you have here, Liz commented. Yeah, it does the job, I suppose. Come on, I know Anna will be keen to meet you. Jenna too, he said with genuine excitement in his voice. She followed him in, noting the average aegis around the house which parted to let them through before he opened the front door. The inside was also well appointed, with lush carpets and plenty of old-fashioned ornaments and side tables. Anna, Richard called out. Through here, called out a female voice from a side room. Richard led them through to where a woman in her late 20s, maybe early 30s, stood waiting for them. However, Liz knew as well as anybody that with the Magi, appearances can be very deceptive when many of them were basically immortal. The woman, who must be this Anna Richard was talking about, looked a little surprised to see Liz walk in. She raised her eyebrows and looked back at Richard, clearly waiting for an explanation. Anna, this is Liz Fox. She's part of Amanda Jane Page's coven in New York, Richard explained. Oh, that Liz, she said. That's right. She's in London and I just bumped into her. I can't believe it. After hearing so much about her and her mentor, it's amazing, right? Anna smiled and stepped forward, offering her hand. Liz, welcome. You'll have to excuse Richard. He and Jenna hear a lot of what's going on in the Magi world through the web and, well, they got quite into the stories of your mentor recently. I hope you can forgive his enthusiasm. He's harmless, really. Of course, Liz smiled, feeling much more at ease with Anna. She had a much calmer nature from what Liz could see and had a professional attitude to her. She wore a pencil skirt and tights with a silk shirt, looking more like a businesswoman than a magus. Hey, I'm right here, you know, Richard said. I'm sorry. I'm just a little excited is all. It's not often you meet a celebrity. Hardly, Liz corrected him. Hey, I'm going to find Jenna, I bet, he said, stopping suddenly and pulling out his phone as it buzzed once in his pocket. He looked at the screen and frowned, his whole demeanour changing suddenly. Everything okay? Anna asked. Yeah, sorry, it's just my sister, Ellie. She needs some help with something. Sorry, I got a dash. Introduce Liz to Jenna for me, will ya? Sorry, Liz, I'll be back soon if you're hanging around. Thanks for not running a mile when I collared you on the street. No problem, Liz said. Hope your sister's okay. Thanks, he said and ducked out the room. Liz looked back at Anna with a self-conscious smile, suddenly feeling very much like a third wheel. Well, that was short and sweet, Anna said. Hope it's nothing serious, with his sister, I mean, Liz said. I doubt it, she's often calling and getting him to do stuff. She seems a little needy to me. Anyway, as you're here, how about I give you the guided tour? Sure, why not? Liz smiled. Chapter 3. Underpass. Damn it, Richard thought as he closed the house door behind him. Perfect timing by his sister once again. She always called or messaged him at the worst possible moment. Richard couldn't believe his luck when he spotted Liz on that street. He'd done a double take when he saw her. Having seen photos of her and Amanda online on the dark web, the Magi Run forum where he got most of his information about the goings-on in the Magi world. He'd read the stories of Amanda on there, but sorting out the truth from the fiction was not always easy. He'd heard of the events on the island, the explosion, and how she became the chosen one. Richard wasn't sure how much of that he believed, of course, but from that point onwards, Magi were posting about their own encounters with Amanda and Liz and Gentlewater. There were very few celebrities within that Magi world. The closest they got were usually the more well-known masters and archmasters, and those on the Magi Council. You'd hear about some others from time to time, but not consistently. There had been that actress, Melissa Jamel Rowe. He'd seen her in a few films starring alongside some well-known Riven actors. She'd done well for herself. Well, until she died, that is. There were many stories about that as well. It happened in New York, so there were those skeptics who thought that Amanda was implicated in it somehow. He didn't believe them. He just didn't see Amanda and Liz as people who would go about murdering innocents. Not Arcadian Magi, anyway. No, to him, Amanda and her coven were different somehow, and they were appearing all over the place on the dark web. They generated a lot of interest. It didn't hurt that Amanda was quite a good-looking girl as well. Not something that was very unusual for a Magi, of course. Richard shook his head. Get your mind out of the gutter, he thought with a smile. He continued on through the streets as night fell. It wasn't long before he felt pretty sure that he was being followed. He noticed that the same 3 people, all of them wearing hoodies and looking more than a little delinquent, had been behind him for a while now. He opened up the magical spectrum to his vision and put a set of senses looking behind him to watch these 3 youths. He didn't see anything magical about them for the moment, but he knew they could be concealing their magical signature from casual view. So he wasn't ruling that out at all yet. The best thing would be to take some silly routes, do some switchbacks, and see if they followed. He was walking alongside a very busy main road now and spotted an underpass coming up. He didn't like the idea of using it, but figured he'd get through there quick and double back for a while on the other side of the road to see what they did. At the last moment, he ducked right and jogged down into the underpass, down a slope that led to the tunnel that went beneath the road. He paused at the entrance to the tunnel, looking along its dark interior to see if there was any potential danger down there. He saw nothing, just a deserted tunnel, and looked back up the slope to the path above, in time to see the 3 hooded thugs run to the top and point down at him. Shit, they were after him. Suddenly, the underpass didn't feel like quite such a good idea anymore. There was another upward slope going the other direction to the thugs that would keep him on this side of the road, but keep him running away from his pursuers. He turned to run up the slope, away from the hoodies, only to see a woman standing in his way, gripping a long, evil-looking dagger in her right hand. She smiled at him from beneath her long black hair, her ruby lips standing in stark contrast to her pale skin. His automatic reaction was to pump Essentia into his own aegis, strengthening his shield in anticipation of the attack that was sure to come. Essentia surged around the girl, and with a gesture of her free hand, a battering ram of kinetic energy slammed into him, knocking him sideways and into the tunnel wall. Pain shot through his back and arm as he tumbled to the floor with a shout. Who the hell were these guys? If he had to guess, he'd say a nomad group, but he was fairly sure they had a good idea of which nomad covens were active in the area, and these guys didn't ring any bells. He certainly didn't recognize them anyway. Richard scrambled to his feet as he looked behind him to see the goth girl and the 3 hoodies rounding the corner together. He noted the hoodies were no longer hiding their magical signature, their aegises flaring into full life as they approached him. Richard ran at a full sprint, amending his aegis to give himself a force shield as well. It wasn't a strong one, and his aegis had been damaged from the kinetic blast the girl had delivered to him. He'd barely taken a step when he sensed magic flaring up behind him once more, as daggers of Essentia hammered into his aegis from at least 3 of the Magi following him. His aegis flared and fizzled at the magical attacks as it tried to resist. It would be tight. He did not know if he'd make the end of the tunnel before they broke through his aegis, but if he could just get far enough away from them. He glanced back. They were walking. Why were they only walking? He'd be away from them in a matter of... His foot hit a raised concrete slab that hadn't been raised a second before, and suddenly he didn't have a foot beneath him. Richard dropped to the floor hard, hitting his head on the ground and skidding to a stop. "Ah!" he groaned. Perfect, just what he needed. It took him a couple of seconds to gather his thoughts again and remember where he was and what he was doing. But when he looked back down the tunnel to the 4 Magi bearing down on him, the reality of the situation came flooding back. He needed time. Time to get out of here and lose these guys. So he did the first thing that came into his head, raising his hand and channeling Essentia through himself again into a wide kinetic shove, mimicking the effect that the girl had delivered to him not 30 seconds ago. All 4 of them got caught up in the wave and were blown off their feet. They flew backwards and landed in a heap with shouts and yells of pain. Richard jumped up and ran the few more meters to the end of the tunnel, only to be punched in the head with a fist that felt like concrete as he rounded the corner. He felt the crack of his nose just as much as he heard it. The pain was intense as he staggered back, holding his hands up to his face, his warm blood dripping freely onto his palms while his vision swam for a few dizzying seconds. Backing up to just inside the tunnel, he put his back to the wall and squinted forward through the tears that had welled up in his eyes. A man stood there, in old-looking clothing, with a well-worn long coat on him. He had short, cropped hair and took a slow step towards him. "Richard, isn't it?" the man said. Richard frowned at the man. How did he know his name? Who was this Magus? These questions and more flooded through his mind, but they weren't important, so he brushed them aside. He didn't have time for such idiotic thoughts. His life was clearly in danger, so he did his best to concentrate and pull more essentia to him to fuel his next effect. Gathering the magical energy to him, Richard forsook any finesse at all and just threw it at the man, hoping to at least destroy his defences. The energy washed over the probable nomad, damaging his aegis, but nowhere near enough. The nomad returned the favour and sent a hammer blow of essentia at Richard. The effect was a good deal more focused and powerful than Richard's weak attempt. It wasn't surprising, really, though. The intense pain affected his concentration and basically ruined any chance of a coherent magical effect. Similar workings of magic joined this nomad's effect from the other 4 Magi, who had now approached him once again. Richard's aegis lasted all of 3 seconds under that onslaught before it cracked and then disintegrated into nothing. The man who stood before him threw another slam of kinetic force at Richard, ramming him back into the wall once more. Richard hissed and groaned under the power of the attack before slumping down, sliding his back down the wall in defeat and waiting to see what they did to him. The man walked up and then crouched down before him. Why me? How do you know me?" Richard croaked, spitting blood as he spoke. The man smiled and then held up a blood-splattered phone with a pink flowery case that Richard immediately recognised. "Ellie didn't put up much of a fight, you know. She died like the pathetic riven weakling she is. On her knees," he said. Richard groaned as his heart leapt into his throat and his stomach fell. He'd killed Ellie. No, not Ellie. Anything but Ellie, his mind wailed in desperation. More tears welled up in his eyes at the feeling of loss and hopelessness. He loved his sister. He'd basically helped raise her when their mum had left them. Their dad wasn't the most loving of people. He tried, but he was never that great at being a parent. But now, if what this man was saying was true, she was dead, killed by this monster. Rage and anger suddenly rose up with him, deep and powerful and primal. Richard launched himself at this man, intending to claw his eyes out and bite his ear off. The punch was swift, controlled and powerful. It knocked Richard's head back against the wall with a strength that felt like it might have bruised his brain. The world tilted and swam as his vision darkened. Fucking Arcadians! he heard the man say as he fell into oblivion. Chapter 4. Abandoned. Liz took a sip of tea from the cup she held in her hand and relished the refreshing taste of good old English tea. There was nothing really like it, and it had been a long time since she had enjoyed a cup. The stuff you got in the US was never quite the same, and they were far too obsessed with their coffees and lattes and mochaccino thingies. Nope, you really couldn't beat a nice hot steaming cup of tea. She even had a saucer to put her cup on. It was wondrous, really. "Oh," Liz purred. "That's lovely, thank you." "No problem. Don't the Americans have tea?" Anna asked. "They do, but it's not quite the same, you know. I don't know, it's difficult to explain, really. Nothing quite tastes as good as this. Maybe it's the water or something?" Anna nodded and took a sip from her own cup. "It's a lovely place you have here," Liz said. Anna had shown Liz around a good chunk of the house, including the whole of the ground floor. They had a nice setup here. "Thank you. We do what we can to make it homely and not too much like a fortress." "Yeah, that's a tough balance to achieve," Liz said, agreeing with her host. As a magus, you were under constant threat from the other factions. And if it wasn't the Magi who were after you, it was probably one of the Scions. These bloodlines of mutated humans, who had been turned into vampires, were-creatures and worse, were just as bad as the nomads, who they often served with given that they were originally created by the nomads' dark gods, the Archons. Living as a magus meant that you had to constantly be on your guard, and fortifying your house or apartment was pretty much a necessity. Still, you had to fit in with the world around you, so it couldn't be too obvious. Luckily, with their magic, the Magi had ways and means to make their homes near impossible to get into, especially if you wanted to get in quickly and you didn't have the authorization. There were ways around that, of course, such as knowing the backdoor code, but short of mind reading, they were difficult to get a hold of. Suddenly, a young woman that made Liz do a double take walked in. She was stunning, if a little over the top. Blonde, with bouncing curly locks that surrounded a gorgeous and striking face with cheekbones to die for, Liz felt a pang of jealousy. Even in her leggings, boots and fitted turtleneck jumper in the mild temperature of this house, Liz didn't feel terribly warm. But this girl was dressed for a summer's day on the beach with her strappy low-cut top that she was practically bursting out of, and the tiny mini skirt she wore. Liz looked away. She didn't understand girls who dressed this way. Instead, she did her best to ignore her and focus on her cup of tea, enjoying another mouthful of the refreshing taste. As the girl walked up to Anna's desk, Liz noticed the blonde glance down at her and do a double take. The blonde continued to stare for slightly longer than felt comfortable, forcing Liz to acknowledge her. Liz smiled. The blonde blinked before finally speaking. "You're..." Cutting her off, Liz emerged from behind her cup of tea with a smile and offered her hand. "Liz Fox, nice to meet you." "Holy shit! Oh, sorry. Ahem, excuse my language, but it's really you." Liz nodded with a self-conscious smile. "Yeah, it's me," she said, glancing at her hand that was still being offered, but as yet had not been accepted. The girl looked at Liz's hand, and then back at Liz. "Oh, sorry," she said enthusiastically, as she took it and shook it a little too vigorously, nearly spilling Liz's tea. "Ooh, careful," Liz said, doing her best to keep her drink steady. Sorry. I'm just a little excited. I had no idea you were here." "Wow, I have so many questions for you. Is Amanda here?" she said, looking around the room. No, just me, I'm afraid," she said, smiling. Liz glanced at the girl's curvy figure. Her shape reminded her of her mentor. Had this girl... No, surely not. "And you are?" "Jenna, nice to meet you. If I'd known, I'd have dressed for the occasion," she said, looking a little self-conscious about her appearance for a moment. "Don't worry about it. This wasn't a planned visit." "Oh, so you two don't," Jenna said, looking between Liz and Anna. No, Richard bumped into Liz while out on an errand, and Liz kindly came back to meet us all. Ah, Jenna frowned, looking a little confused. That's why I came to see you, actually. I got an alert from one of my GPS trackers. She picked her glasses up that had been hanging off the front of her low-cut top and put them on. She had her laptop under one arm and placed it on the desk, opening it up. Richard's tracker has stopped suddenly. I have his last location, but I'm not powerful enough to scry there, and my locating effect is not picking him up. I'm not sure where he is. You track your Coven members? Liz asked. Jenna here is our resident tech expert, Anna said. She takes the safety of the Coven very seriously. Liz was surprised. Looking at Jenna, she would never have pegged her as a computer nerd. She looked much more like some kind of surfer girl, or the leader of the hockey team or something. The world was full of surprises, she guessed. I have given all the members of the Coven a tracker. This is mine, she said, pointing to a ring on her finger. This way I know where everyone is, and I get an alert when the tracker doesn't transmit, like Richard's. Okay, where was he when the tracker last transmitted? Anna asked. Jenna pulled up a map on the computer. Here, she said. Liz sensed the magic as Anna scried the area, sending her senses out and looking to see if Richard was still there. Liz watched as a look of concern spread over Anna's face until a few seconds later, when she opened her eyes again and focused on the room. It was an underpass. He's not there, but there was some blood on the ground. It looked fresh as well. I don't like this. Okay, you say you can't locate him. Let me have a go, she said, and reached for a nice-looking pen on her desk. She guessed it was probably a gift from Richard and would serve as a sympathetic link to him, allowing her to channel her magic and try and locate him. She closed her eyes again, and Liz felt the essentia blossom once more about the Magi. Anna quickly opened her eyes again, sitting forward with a look of horror on her face. Ah, crap. I found him, I think. I don't know. He's hurt. We have to go now. He's not far. Is he okay? Where is he? Jenna said, desperation leaking into her voice. He's in an old warehouse and he's hurt. I'm coming with you, Jenna said. Me too, Liz agreed. She felt slightly responsible for this. She wasn't sure why, but having just been introduced to these guys and seeing one of them now in trouble, she knew she couldn't just leave. She had to try to help them somehow. Anna looked at her as she pulled on her coat. Are you sure? There's no need, really. We can handle this. I'm coming, Liz said, making sure her tone was severe enough to convey her seriousness as she stood up and pulled on her own jacket. The more the merrier, Anna said and led them from the room. Jenna picked up a tiny jacket from the hallway as Anna led them outside and unlocked one car that stood in the driveway. Liz jumped in the back. She was the guest after all. Anna sped out of the driveway and gunned the engine as they pulled out onto the street. Will Callie and Rory be okay? Jenna asked. Don't see why not, Anna said as she concentrated on the road ahead. Anna had been right. The warehouse was close to their place, and it only took them a little over 10 minutes to get there. They parked up on an industrial estate next to a large, disused building. No one was around as it was well after working hours now, and there was little in the way of light here. When the car lights went out, Liz realised how dark it had become. Lead the way, Liz said to Anna, who was looking a little more worried now. But she nodded and walked towards a nearby door that had a sturdy-looking chain threaded through the handle, secured with a chunky padlock. With a small working of magic, the chain broke and clattered to the floor, allowing the door to be opened with a shriek of metal from the rusted hinges. Liz looked around them into the darkness. Her vision was now expanded into spectrums of light not usually visible to the human eye. She could see everything she could have wanted as clear as day, including heat signatures if she needed. No one was about, and everything remained quiet. Turning back, Liz followed Jenna inside, who was close on the heels of Anna. A few steps into the building, and Liz couldn't help but notice the loud clicking from the footsteps of Jenna, She screwed up her face in consternation at the ridiculous heels that the girl wore. They're a broken ankle waiting to happen, she thought. Liz used a minor working of magic to dampen the sound they were making, applying it to the entire group so as not to single Jenna out too much. Anna led them upstairs and through a series of decaying offices until they exited through to the other side and onto a wide open area on the first floor. There, in the middle of it, slumped on a chair, unmoving, was Richard. Liz looked at his bruised and bloodied form and didn't need to use her magic to know he was clearly dead. She used it anyway, though, just to confirm Richard's condition. Jenna ran forward and dropped to her knees next to him, sobbing while Liz and Anna both took a more cautious approach and looked all about them. Liz looked for anything indicating there might be other Magi here, or for any hint of a trap, but there was nothing. Liz relaxed a little and watched Anna walk over to Jenna. Anna put her hand around Jenna's shoulders as she crouched down next to her, whispering words of comfort. Liz stayed back, but looked at Richard. He'd been beaten up, tortured. This had been systematic and done with purpose. She also noticed a phone with a pink case on the floor nearby. The screen had been smashed. Liz walked over and picked it up, tapping the power button. Surprisingly, it still worked and appeared to be without any security measures to stop anyone getting into it. Liz opened up the messages and checked the most recent one, which was listed as brother. As she expected, this must have been Ellie's phone, and she could see the latest message from Ellie, or whoever had been using this phone, summoning Richard to come and help her. He was lured here and tortured, Liz said. Any idea why and by who? Anna looked up. No, I mean other than the usual suspects that all Arcadians have. Nomads, Liz said to herself. This just felt like the work of some nomads to her, rather than the Inquisition. There was none of the usual religious paraphernalia around that would point to an inquisitorial mission. They always liked to broadcast their operations, so she doubted it would be them. No, this felt much more like something some nomads would do. But why? What did Richard know that would be of value to some nomads, and why leave him here where he would be found? He wouldn't have been found by any Riven, though. This place was abandoned, and the lack of graffiti in here told Liz that it wasn't as yet being visited by any kids or anything. So, he'd been left here for his coven to find, and they had to know that they would find him. This was done for us, for you, I mean. You were supposed to find him to come here. But the nomads aren't here. Why? Liz mused aloud. We're very close to our house, Anna said. The Coven house, Liz exclaimed. That's why they tortured him, Anna said. They wanted to get into the house. They lured me here because I was the most likely to come out, and the strongest, and now they can get in the house. Shit, let's get back. Jenna, come on, we can come back for him later. We need to leave. Callie and Rory are in danger. But I can't leave him here, Jenna cried. I can't. Anna grabbed her by the shoulders and forced Jenna to look at her. We'll come back, I promise, but right now our friends need us. Right, you're right. Okay, I'm coming, she said, touching Richard's cold cheek one last time. Liz raced out with them, helping Jenna along and getting into the back seat with her. Seconds later, they were speeding along the roads, dodging around cars and trying to get back as quick as they could. Halfway back, Anna's phone buzzed. Pressing a button on the steering wheel, the sound came through the car's speakers as she answered it. Anna! Shouted a female voice that Liz didn't recognise. Callie! Anna exclaimed. Are you okay? Where are you? We're under attack here. Shit, get back as quick as... The call clicked off. Callie? Anna shouted before hitting the wheel in frustration with her fist. Liz stayed quiet. There was nothing she could say that would make the situation better. Anna needed to concentrate on the road anyway and get them back to their house as quick as they could. The minutes that it actually took seemed like hours. Every car that got in the way appeared to be driving at 20 miles an hour, causing ever more frustration for Anna as she did her best to get them home quickly without endangering too many other road users. Eventually, Anna brought the car skidding into the grounds of the Coven house stopping short of the building itself. Liz noted the front door had been knocked off its hinges. She hated being right sometimes. Chapter 5. Invasion. "Let's go," Anna urgently called from the front seat. Liz's aegis had been boosted up as far as she was able, so that as she jumped from the car, the surrounding air practically crackled with magical energy. She'd struggled with the seatbelt briefly before getting out, which put her behind the other two women as they all ran for the house. Liz briefly marvelled at Jenna's ability to run in those heels. Now that was impressive. They clattered through the doorway, stepping over the debris of the ruined door, noting the chaos and destruction that had been wrought in here. Over the shoulder of Jenna and Anna, Liz spotted 3 figures, all of them in street clothing wearing hoodies. 2 men and a woman from what she could see. One man was a huge guy with a military-style haircut, while the other had a more lean build with a mop of greasy hair. The girl wore a full tracksuit with her hood up, and her mousy hair falling about her face. She also spotted another figure kneeling on the floor before them, beaten and covered in his own blood. He looked about ready to drop. She guessed this was Rory, one of the other 2 members of Anna's coven. Where was Callie, Liz thought. "Let him go," Anna yelled at the trio as she stalked up the hallway. The 3 nomads smiled at them. "Or what?" said the big guy. The thin guy just laughed while the girl gave them one of the evilest-looking smiles Liz had seen in a while. Anna hesitated, but looked ready to fight. The nomad girl must have taken that as a direct challenge as she ran at Anna with a scream, pulling out a knife from the back of her tracksuit. Anna stepped forward to meet her, Essentia building and then flaring as their respective aegises connected. Anna twisted, probably hoping to evade much of the girl's attack, but she held on to Anna and pulled her sideways so that they both fell into the room to Liz's right, with yells from both of them. Right behind the girl, the thinner man came leaping forward, throwing magical attacks at Jenna, who threw her energy into her shield and defended against them well. Liz smiled. She could hold her own for the moment, she guessed, which left Liz with an opportunity to maybe save Rory. Liz ducked left into Anna's office, knowing there was another door in there that led around to where the bigger man stood next to Rory. She moved quickly, ducking through the door and crossing the next room without trouble, making her way to the door opposite, which stood open. Sneaking through, she spotted Rory and the bigger nomad right away, but crucially, the nomad had not seen her. Liz moved silently between the furniture to give herself a clear run at him before speeding up into a sprint. A few meters out from the nomad, he must have heard or sensed her and turned to look at Liz with a look of shock and hate. Liz adjusted her run and stepped to the wall, running up it with a magical shifting of gravity. Her change of tactic caught him by surprise as she launched at him and kicked at his face with an Essentia-charged foot that cracked his aegis and connected with a sickening crack that sent him flying backwards. Liz landed next to the big man and summoned all the Essentia she could at that moment and funneled it into a single hit as the man attempted to get his hands beneath him and pick himself up. The punch connected cleanly and smashed through his aegis with Essentia to spare before channeling the rest of it into his head. He fell back with a yell, dropped his knife, and put both hands to his ruined cheek. Liz spotted the knife and lunged for it, grabbing it from the floor as the nomad caught her left arm with one of his huge hands. "Don't run away from me," he growled, mistakenly taking her lunge away from him as a sign of her wanting to escape. "Wouldn't think of it," she answered, and used his own pull against him to throw herself on top of him and slam his knife into his temple. The man tensed and then went limp as Liz pushed herself up from him. It wasn't the first man she'd ever killed fighting nomads, but that was probably the most up-close and personal kill she'd ever done. She turned to look at Rory. He'd slumped to the floor, so she stepped up to him and checked on him with a quick scan of magic. He was alive. A little bruised with a couple of broken bones, but he'd live. Yelps from up the corridor caught Liz's attention as she heard the sounds of fighting. "Ah!" Jenna cried. "Get off me, you freak! Fuck! Ah! It sounded like she was struggling. Liz stood and strode off down the corridor, passing the room where Anna fought the female nomad. They seemed fairly evenly matched from her quick glance. Following the sounds of Jenna's struggle to a door on the right, Liz saw that the smaller nomad man had somehow got Jenna into a bear hug. He stood behind, with his arms wrapped around her, as Jenna twisted and struggled, even going in for a bite on his arm. "Oi," Liz called, making the nomad stop and look. Jenna glanced up also, an expression of desperation and hope spreading over her features. "Well, hello there," said the nomad in a leering tone in his voice that Liz didn't really care for. "Come to join in the fun?" "Not really," Liz said, and with a quick flick of essentia, sent a metal statue at the side of the room flying. It clipped the nomad's head with a satisfying thud, causing him to release Jenna and reach for his bleeding temple. Jenna turned and clenched her fists. "You dirty fucker," she growled, and stomped on his foot with one of her stiletto heels. The nomad howled and doubled over with pain. Jenna grabbed his head and kneed him sharply in the face. The man dropped with a face covered in his own blood. Jenna reached for the metal statue that Liz had thrown across the room and finished the man off with several blows to the head. Liz didn't hang around to see the result. Instead, she ran back to the other room to find Anna on her back, with the nomad girl on top of her. They both held onto the girl's knife with a death grip as the girl tried to force the blade down into Anna's chest. Both hissed with the strain and effort, puffing and panting as they fought. Liz ran in and delivered a kick to the nomad's head with as much force as she could muster. Launched across the room by Liz's enhanced strength and magical energy, the girl crunched into the far wall. The nomad dropped to the floor as Anna looked up at Liz in shock and gratitude. The nomad girl groaned. Anna and Liz looked over at her. Liz took a step forward only for Anna to put her hand out as she got to her feet. "No, she's mine," Anna said. Liz could see the nomad's aegis was still in effect, but waited to see how Anna would handle it. A quick minor working of magic flared around Anna's hand, and Liz noticed a handgun appear in Anna's grip that had not been there before. The gun positively glowed in Liz's magical sight as Anna walked over to the nomad and levelled the pistol at the girl's head and started firing. The girl's aegis, which obviously had a force shield element to it, stopped the first few bullets dead. But the Essentia-fueled bullets cracked open that aegis within 4 shots. The 5th decorated the carpet with brains and bits of skull. Magically suppressed, the gun was quiet, with only a small muffled thud reaching Liz's ears. She doubted anyone else in this house would have heard it. Anna sighed. "I've done that countless times now, and it never gets any easier," she said, half to herself. "Which is as it should be," Liz said. "Indeed. Come on, we have to find Callie. I don't think that was the last of them," Anna said, and left the room. Liz followed and found Jenna outside in the hallway, giving Anna a hug. "You okay?" Anna asked. "Yeah, thanks to Liz here," Jenna smiled. "I think we both owe Liz," Anna said. "Come on, I don't think this is over yet." Anna walked up the hall with Jenna close behind. Liz followed. They could hear movement upstairs, thuds and muffled voices. Anna started up the steps but stopped part way. A woman in floaty black clothing, equally dark hair and an alabaster face, with 2 daggers at the ready, blocked their way. Beyond her, a man in tattered clothing with a rugged face dragged a young girl, maybe about 20 years old, out of a side room by her hair. He frowned down at Liz and her friends. "Back already?" he asked. I underestimated you." Liz stepped forward, putting her hands on the shoulders of Jenna and Anna. "I'll deal with the crow up there. You get Callie." Anna nodded at her and let her through. Liz stalked up the stairs, keeping her eyes fixed on the girl in black. If she had to have guessed, it looked like this girl would be the better fighter, but she also guessed that the man would be the more skilled magus, so it made sense for Anna. The strongest magus in their little trio to take him on while she confronted the goth girl. The crow backed off a touch as Liz reached the top of the stairs, but watched her movements carefully. Liz shook her head slowly. "You give goths a bad name, young lady," she said. "Like I give a shit what you think," the crow said. "Who are you?" the man said from across the landing. "You're not a member of this coven." Liz didn't take her eyes off the crow. "Nope, I'm not. And you can call me Liz. Who are you?" "None of your business," he replied before turning to the crow. "Patience. Kill her, will you? She's pissing me off." Patience rolled her eyes. "With pleasure." She lunged. Liz blocked it, knocking the hand wide and forcing Patience to stagger backwards a step. "Go," said Liz, and felt rather than saw Anna run past her. Patience lunged for her again, but this time Liz was better prepared and could already gauge the girl's skill with the blades. Liz dodged again but caught hold of the hand. With a twist, she released the blade from Patience's grip and spun, slashing at her. She was quick, though, and Liz's blade caught only clothing. The girl's floaty tops made it tough to judge where her body was. Patience didn't let up, though, and rushed in again, swinging her blade back and forth. Liz dodged, knocking the knife away a few times with the one she had liberated from the girl's grip. Liz stayed on the defensive, getting the feeling that this girl was not terribly patient, and did her best to goad her in, wanting her to overextend herself and open herself up to a return attack. It didn't take long, and Liz made the most of it, catching her arm in a much better grip. Liz dropped into a crouch and forced the girl's arm down over her knee. Her elbow bent backwards with a sickening crack as the girl screamed in pain. Her defences down, Liz backhanded the girl across the face, smacking her head into a nearby doorframe. She dropped to the floor, knocked out cold. She'd let Anna deal with her after this had come to a conclusion, she thought, and turned to take in the situation. Close by, but hanging back, Jenna threw as much a censure as she could muster at the man, but he was ignoring her. Instead, he threw tables, chairs, and chunks of wall at Anna, in a near-constant bombardment that had Anna concentrating on just defending herself, pumping more and more essentia into her shield to keep it from breaking. Nearby, Liz noticed Anna's gun on the floor. She'd probably tried to use it only for him to knock it from her grasp. She picked it up, feeling the reassuring weight of it in her hand, and took careful aim at the man who appeared to be oblivious to her at the moment. Feeling sure of her targeting, she pulled the trigger over and over again, firing off shot after shot at the man. She'd aimed for his body, choosing to go for the biggest target and get more hits rather than go for his head and potentially miss more. Barely a second after her first shot, the constant telekinetic attacks on Anna stopped as the man backed away, letting go of Callie as his aegis flared and cracked. With a last spark from the latest bullet, his aegis disintegrated, allowing the next shot to slam into his shoulder and the next one into his stomach. Liz stopped firing as he dropped to the floor, holding his body and looking at his hands in disbelief. Liz followed Anna and walked up closer to the nomad, who looked up at them both in horror. How could you?" he stammered. Liz said nothing, and neither did Anna. "Tacitor," he called in desperation. "Tacitor, I don't think—" "No, you don't, do you, Carson?" said a female voice from a room just beyond the man. Liz looked up to see a woman in there, watching. She had long blonde and brown dreadlocks that spilt over her denim jacket and black tank top. She also wore a faded denim miniskirt over ripped fishnet tights and finished the look off with huge black goth boots with chrome buckles and a bunch of chrome and silver necklaces and bracelets. Piercings glinted in her face as she spoke. "And that's why you're on your knees now," she finished, before a sudden flash of essentia slammed into Carson, ripping huge lacerations across his body, spurting blood everywhere. One of them slashed across his face, revealing his skull and popping his eye out. Liz backed off, feeling sick as the man dropped to the floor. Essentia flared in the far room once more as Tacitor disappeared, porting away, leaving the house to fall silent. Chapter 6. Farewell. Liz stood in the kitchen of Anna's Coven house. She'd helped heal the members of Anna's Coven, tidy the place up, and deal with the remains of the nomads. After a brief hunt through the mind of Patience to find out a little more about this nomad coven and what had happened to Richard, Anna had wasted no time in putting a bullet through her head. They quickly disposed of the bodies, able to use their magic to leave no trace of them before they finished the clean-up of the house. They had also retrieved the body of Richard, which they planned to bury in the woods later. Such was the secretive life of the Magi. In the end, only Richard had died, despite the best efforts of the nomad coven, but it was a loss that was hitting Jenna the hardest out of all of them. Liz didn't want to stay too long. She did her bit to help clean up, but after that, she quietly mentioned to Anna that she had better be on her way. Jenna had noticed her imminent departure and thanked her for everything with a hug, leaving Anna to walk her to the door. "Thanks again, Liz. I'm not sure what we would have done without you," Anna said. "Don't underestimate yourself. You could have come out on top of that." "Maybe, whatever, it's done with now, and I'm just glad that you were around to help." "No thanks required, really. Anyone else would have done the same. You know how to reach me. Let me know if there's anything else I can do for you," Liz said. "I will. Have a safe trip home," Anna said and waved to Liz as she walked out of the driveway. Despite the somewhat desperate situation and the obvious risk of death she had put herself in, helping that coven and being there for them when they needed her was just what she needed. She'd come back to London to take a view on her life, to think through the recent events in New York with Amanda and her friends. She'd thought that seeing her old home and reliving some of those memories was what she needed. But in fact, that had only brought her mood down to depress her. That's not to say her past wasn't important, it was, and it informed her future and who she needed to be. But wallowing in it was not healthy. Her past was filled with tragedy and the deaths of those who had been closest to her. But she had come out the other side and found a new life with new friends who loved her just as much. She would never forget Francesca, her sister, and she would always have the happy memories of their life together as they grew up. She also knew that if she could speak with Fran, she knew Fran would not want her to grieve for the rest of her life. Fran would want her to take this new life, these new wondrous powers, and to do some good with them and live the life she had to the fullest. She didn't regret coming back here either, because otherwise, how would she have come to this conclusion? If she had stayed in New York, she might have figured things out, but she would not have been in the right place at the right time to help Anna and her coven when they needed her. Anna had done some digging during the clean-up through the dark web, and it seemed that Carson was the leader of a nomad coven that had recently set up shop in London. From her research, she discerned that the coven had comprised of Carson, the goth girl Patience, the crazy Hale, the big guy that Liz had killed, Trent and Ivy, who had fought Anna downstairs. But there was no mention of Tacita, so whoever that was would remain a mystery for the time being. Even with all the death and the fighting, she felt good about how things had played out. She'd done everything she could, and her training by Amanda, Zane, and Orion had stood her in very good stead. She had held her own and provided some much-needed backup when Anna and Jenna needed her most. Finding herself on a quiet street, Liz opened up her link with Gentle Water and sent a pulse through to him. "Liz, how may I help you?" Gentle Water said in his soft Asian accent. "If you have a moment, I could do with a pickup." "One moment." He closed the link. With a whip crack and a flare of essentia, Gentle Water had suddenly appeared before her. "Thanks. How have you been?" Liz asked. "I am well, thank you," he said with a smile. "Back to New York." "Of course," she said. Invisible magical energy flared again, and with another faint snap of rushing air, the two figures on the shadowy street disappeared without the fanfare of showy special effects. If you didn't know better, it was as if they had never been there at all. The end. This has been Uprising, a Magi Saga story, by Andrew Dobell. You can find out more about the Magi Saga and the author's other stories by going to his website at andrewdobellauthor.com.